Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Dirks, and on behalf of ACRL and Choice, I'd like to welcome you to our program today, which is Exploring Intersectionality and LGBTQ Issues with Primary Sources and eBooks, which is sponsored by Gale, a Cengage company. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from ACRL and Choice that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library community. Free to users, the structured 60-minute live presentations provide the opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I'd like to point out a few features of the webinar software. In the main area of the screen, you should be able to follow along with the presentation materials. Along the right-hand side, you will likely see a Q&A panel and a chat panel. If you don't, you can click the button that's sort of a little dialogue cloud on the bottom of your screen to enable the Q&A, or the chat panel. The Q&A panel, if you move your mouse, you should be able to see three little dots. The Q&A panel is in the pop-up menu that comes up from the three little dots. Please use the chat panel to communicate with me about any technical issues you may be having. And the Q&A panel is where we'll queue your questions for our panelists. We'll save that for a dedicated Q&A time at the end. So please do feel free to send questions in for our panelists today throughout the presentation. We are using hashtag today. You can shout out to us at ACRL Choice Webinars during and after the event. So if you've got another screen handy, please feel free to talk with us. We're at choice_reviews on Twitter. And our speakers today are Sean Smith-Cruz and Mark Epprecht. And here to introduce them is Julie Carnegie from Gale.
Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar on exploring intersectionality and LGBTQ issues with primary sources and eBooks. My name is Julie Carnegie, and I'm a content strategist for Gale. Gale has a history of producing products such as the Archives of Sexuality and Gender and the forthcoming Global Encyclopedia of Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, and Queer History that explore the topic of diversity. Both of these products can be used to delve into intersectionality and LGBTQ issues through research and instruction. Our first speaker, Sean Smith-Cruz, who is an assistant professor and head of reference at the Graduate Center Library at City University of New York. She is a volunteer coordinator at the Lesbian Her Story Archives, board co-chair at the Center of LGBTQ Studies, and an advisory board member to the Gale LGBTQ archival databases. Sean began processing the collection of the Salsa Soul Sisters, the first lesbian of color organization in the country, and she presented on archiving Black lesbians as keynote to the 2016 International LGBTQ Archivists, Librarians, Museum, Curators, and Special Libraries Conference. Sean has a BS in Queer Women's Studies from CUNY, an MFA in Creative Writing and Fiction, and an MLS with a focus on archiving and records management, both from Queens College. This afternoon, Sean will briefly demonstrate how to use an archive to research intersectionality through the LGBTQ lens. Our second panelist this afternoon is Mark Epprecht. Mark is a professor and former department head of the Global Development Studies at Queen's University in Ontario, Canada. Mark has served as an advisory board member and co-editor on Scribner's Global Encyclopedia of Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, Queer History, in addition to writing or editing several other books and articles on sexuality and HIV/AIDS in Africa. Mark has won several honors and awards for his work, including the 2009 Desmond Tutu Award for Outstanding Contributions to the Study of Gender and Sexuality in Africa. In addition to his years teaching at Queen's University, Mark also taught several years at the University of Zimbabwe. Mark holds a BA and MA from York University and a PhD from Dalhousie University. Today, Mark will briefly demonstrate how he uses eBooks to instruct his students on the intersection of HIV/AIDS in Africa. Now let's welcome Sean with her presentation.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Julie, for that introduction. Thanks, everyone, for having me. I wanted to continue to introduce you to myself through the affiliations that I have, which I'm going to mention the Lesbian Herstory Archives in this talk. I won't mention CLAGS as much, but I had to give a shout out to the Center for LGBTQ Studies here at the Graduate Center. And then, of course, we're going to mention Gale. So to start with the Graduate Center, we are a premier doctoral granting entity of the second largest urban university in the country, the City University of New York. We hold over 30 centers and institutes, including the Center for LGBTQ Studies, or CLAGS. So there I'm mentioning CLAGS again. And we are also, CLAGS was founded by Martin Duberman. I should just also say I'm co-chairing the board right now, and I'm chair to the Committee on Archives. We also have 150 core faculty here at the Grad Center, whose presence is enhanced by over 1,800 faculty from across the 24 campuses. Our library, however, holds less than 1 dozen full-time librarians who are liaisons to over 50 academic departments to promote just over 300 electronic resources. So, and we have 1 floor of books. So we are a small operation, and we have no university archivist to manage the archival research inquiries as they appear. And as faculty-appointed librarians, we are also able to fully engage in the scholarship of our field and provide service to the library community. And it's really through my liaisoning with LGBT subjects, as well as women's studies, gender studies, Africana studies, but also as a faculty librarian that I'm able to do the work with Lesbian Herstory Archives and CLAGS, just to show a bit of our structure. I'm hoping that this talk, which is largely about intersectionality and primary resources, will be useful to you, hoping that you will find some commonalities with the CUNY structure as you do with your own library, whether it be being a liaison to a subject that is not your primary field or responding to inquiries about primary sources, even if you don't have a background in archiving. Oops, sorry, I'm going to make sure I can pass through these. However, I wanted to make sure that those of you who came to this webinar to discuss topics about serving LGBTQ populations in general had resources. Firstly, the webinar I did last year for Gale did cover, Sarah Howard covered, who's from Princeton, covered a nice overview of how to work with populations, and then I spoke about using archival materials in general and copyright. So if you are interested in those topics, I want to point to the National School Library Standards infographic for building and safeguarding your school's LGBTQ collections. It points to topics on school climate, community engagement, campus safety as they relate to LGBTQ materials and libraries. We're not going to talk about that in this webinar, so I just wanted to make sure that you knew that we were not going to cover these detailed perspectives of campus climate. And instead, we're going to speak on intersectionality as it pertains to LGBTQ subjects within primary resources and eBooks. So hopefully you're in the right webinar. So intersectionality, what is its definition? I'm going to use here Patricia Hill Collins and Surma Bilgi's 2016 publication. It's a monograph called Intersectionality. And they describe it as a way of understanding and analyzing the complexity in the world, in people, and in human experiences. The events and conditions of social and political life and the self can seldom be understood as shaped by one factor. They are generally shaped by many factors in diverse and mutually influencing ways. When it comes to social inequality, people's lives and the organization of power in a given society are better understood as being shaped not by a single axis of social division, be it race or gender or class, and we can add here, or sexual orientation, but by many axes that work together and influence each other. Intersectionality as an analytic tool gives people better access to the complexity of the world and of themselves. So in other words, if I were to paraphrase this, intersectionality is the woven, interlocked, continuous overlap of experiences, identity, and humanity. It can be used as a tool to further investigate all subjects of life. And because intersectionality began among the work of Black women scholars who were highlighting the challenges of Black women activists in the civil rights, feminist, and labor movements, it was really their aim to find themselves at the center of these various movements. I think we can successfully apply intersectionality as an analytic tool for LGBTQ studies in the library. So I'd like to share a few pulled quotes from LGBTQ scholars so that we can apply intersectionality, scholars and writers, from their own narratives, for whom I think this is a clear indicator of the definition of intersectionality. I must begin always with Audre Lorde. In her 1983 bulletin, or rather essay in the Bulletin Homophobia in Education, her article, my phone is ringing. Let me just turn that off. Okay. She says, within the lesbian community, I am Black, and within the Black community, I am a lesbian. There is no hierarchy of oppression. I cannot afford the luxury of fighting one form of oppression only. And of course, she said this in 1983 prior to the branding of intersectionality, but it directly applies. Then we'll hear from Anna Marine Lara, who wrote my favorite novel, Urzuli Skirt. It's a book, if you haven't heard of it, about a relationship between a Haitian and Dominican lesbian. A Haitian lesbian and a Dominican lesbian, and their road to freedom and survival through the power of spiritual magic. So she said this in an essay as a part of a self-published piece called Musings Under the Moon, Voices and Images of Dominican Lesbians by Jacqueline Jimenez Polanco. Ana Marine says, I am a Dominican lesbiana, una lesbiana dominicana. I am also a whole lot of other things, which I love when she says that, but we'll get to that. For now, I wanted to start by asking, what does it mean to me to be a Dominican lesbian? Before I was a lesbian, I was queer. And before that, I was butch. And even before that, I was bisexual. And you know what? Before that, most people thought I was straight. My last example for narratives is Mae Josephs, who's a professor at Pratt Institute. And I wanted to highlight that because I teach graduate library students reference and instruction at Pratt. She states in her 1998 essay, Transatlantic Inscriptions, Desire, Diaspora, and Cultural Citizenship, which was inside of Ella Shohat's groundbreaking text, which at this point seems as if it was before its time. The text is Talking Visions, Multicultural Feminism in a Transnational Age. This has slashes because it's written as a poem, so the slashes mean the end of a line. Joseph says, there is no essential Black subject. What does it mean for Afro-South Asians to claim Blackness? In Britain, in the Caribbean, in the East and South Africa. In the US, coolies, slaves, indentured servants. If you have long hair, how come you are a dyke? If you're bi, you're not queer. Being bi, lesbian, or queer in the diaspora, struggling for coherence, traveling many bodies, multiple nations, her Blackness tenuously wrapped around her, must the name be the accounting? I want to point to this consistent mention and focus of naming and identity to uncover the perspective of intersectionality and LGBTQ issues as they relate to primary sources, which I think I can display holds the weight of personal narrative and community histories inside of its structures. So from here, I'm going to turn to the Gale primary sources, and just to note that their catalog does hold over 300 primary source products. It does include within that 300 the gender and sexuality, the Archives of Gender and Sexuality, which has 2 parts, for which I am on the advisory board, and then it also has the Women's Studies Archive, Women's Issues and Identities, which I believe holds some similar materials. So to supply a scope note, the Archives of Sexuality and Gender, LGBTQ History and Culture since 1940 consists of 20 individual collections with a total count of nearly 1.5 million pages. The documents span from 1940 to 2014, with the bulk being from 1950 to 1990. And although most of the materials are in English, the archive contains periodicals in multiple languages. 4 collections are sourced from the Lesbian Herster Archive, which is the largest lesbian-focused archive in the world. 2 are sourced from the Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, Transgender Historical Society, and others are sourced from the New York Public Library, the London School of Economics, and from the National Institutes of Health. The example, which is somewhat anecdotal, somewhat fictionalized, is of a recent reference transaction that I had with an undergraduate student who came to me from outside of the grad center, because we only have graduate students here, but I wanted to talk about an undergraduate experience since I figure a lot of the people listening may work with undergraduates. And the student was sent to me by a colleague at the Brooklyn College campus. He was an older African-American gentleman wanting to search the etymology of language or the rhetorics as they pertain to the term LGBTQ. So he came to me and said, when did LGBTQ first begin to stand in for lesbian and gay? And he asked, I'd like to know, or he sort of firmly stated, I'd like to know the first utterance of this term. His age matters because in this case, he was adamant that in his lifetime, the shift happened, and he'd like to get to the bottom of this shift in language from a scholarly perspective. I began the reference interaction with a search of the secondary literature. Perhaps someone has already discussed this as a dissertation chapter, or he could sort of just see what others have done with the primary source data, because often primary resources are data, and it's not really the work of an undergraduate to start doing research on data. They should just be pulling, citing other people who've done that research. But after 30 minutes of searching through social science databases, it was clear that this investigative query led to more questions than answers. We realized it would be beneficial for him to see the LGBTQ community as many communities. Using intersectionality as an analytic tool in this case, we understood that the Black lesbian community, for example, may have adopted language at a different rate than Black gay men. Similarly, mainstream LGBT agendas were calling to shifts in name, often through centers and institutes. But this was likely far after it had been adopted in everyday vernacular. But he attested that it was possible that the name shift was forced upon individuals by institutions. And so he wanted me to just do the search. So we searched LGBT in order to see if we could find the first time that it was mentioned, by finding whether or not, if we sorted by date, the first time it was mentioned would appear. And what we found was, although we got early pieces, whether it be the 1967 Journal of Clinical Psychology or the 1982 Journal of Homosexuality, it was very difficult to search when LGBT was in the actual text, because the subject searching has been created post the shift of language. So that meant regardless of whether in 1967 LGBT didn't exist as a term, the subject focus would have it there. And so making the search for lesbian and gay and not LGBT as a Boolean search was virtually impossible. With these implications, more questions were asked. I tried to get him to narrow it down. What geographic parameter would you prefer? He said nationally. I said, what field of study were you seeking? He said, all of them. Which community within the LGBTQ umbrella? He says, everyone. So you can see that ultimately this student did not want an intersectional analysis for his research. He wanted to see LGBT as a monolith without any individuation within communities. And so we still went to primary sources. And within the GALE, the Archive of Sexuality and Gender, we did a search for LGBT, and we found that if we did the same act where we sorted by date, the same issue appeared, where you can see that in the text itself, there is film festival. The text says San Francisco Gay Film Festival, and that's what it was called in 1980. The subject field has San Francisco International LGBT Film Festival because that's what it's called now. And so the same issue occurred with the same level of redundancy. To appease his general search, I used the term frequency tool, which Gail has, and did a search using the search term LGBT. And what we found was that in 99, there was a peak. And since this was the peak time, it was a good enough answer for the student despite its inaccuracy. So just to give an example of when it was beneficial to the student and when the resources were useful, I wanted to briefly pull out and mention that I pull from my personal narrative and mention that I just had a baby, and I moved to Connecticut, so I'm hardly ever at the Lesbian Herstory Archives. There's the baby. I figured I couldn't do this talk without showing everybody the cute baby. So although I bring little Paige Joey to the Dyke March when she was 6 weeks old, and again on her first birthday, I also bring her to my presentation. So there was her at the Wendy Subway Artivist series in April. And even though I can't sort of get to the archives, the coordinators do send me questions. So I did get a recent question from a master's student who was interested in anything that was pertaining to third world women. And specifically, she was interested in Salsa Soul Sisters, or they were interested in Salsa Soul Sisters. And they wanted to know if there were any Asian, Indigenous, immigrant women in the collection. Now, mind you, this researcher was not located in New York City, so both of us could not physically get to the Lesbian Herstory Archives. And that is when I realized that the Gale resource was a useful resource. This researcher was available or did have access to a university library. And so I pointed them to the Archives of Sexuality and Gender, which they had to actually check with their librarian to see if it was purchased. But when we did a search for third world women, we received over 500 results of newspapers and periodicals pertaining to third world women, mostly dated in the mid-'80s. Similarly, if we searched Native American women, there were 1970s references from the subject files at the Lesbian Herstory Archives, which I knew was there, but it's so much different to send someone an email and say, when you finally get there one day, you can search this file, or well, why don't you go ahead and pull the primary sources directly? And finally, I was able to show this researcher that a search for Asian lesbians, as an example, could search not only the subjects, but the full text of the resource so that you can actually get to, at your fingertips, the material that lives inside of this historic archive. So I'm going to end there, and I have a list of sources that I believe when this is posted, you'll be able to access on your own. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. And I guess I'll pass it over to Mark.
Thanks. Thanks, Shauna and Julie for the introduction. And I'm going to talk about teaching. Okay, so there's me in front of a classroom, and I teach here in Ontario now. But as Julie mentioned, I was a lecturer at the University of Zimbabwe back in the 90s, and it was at that time that I got interested in the topic I've been researching for, now it's a couple of decades, but I don't know if people remember back in 95, the president of Zimbabwe, who was recently forcibly retired, he started making speeches all around the country, kind of denouncing gays and lesbians as, some kind of existential threat to the country, and implying that they are coming from the West, to corrupt the good values of the African citizens. And this made me curious where was this coming from, because honestly, you didn't see a lot of gays and lesbians on campus or anywhere in any recognizable way. So I wondered what all the fuss was about. I started the research, and actually one of the first things I noticed in the region, there is a history of LGBT organizing and activism. It goes back really to the 60s, actually before Stonewall. There was an incident, and that involved basically white South Africans. So it's immediately obvious in the history of this topic that race was an extremely important factor in the way that people identified and the way that they organized and fought the homophobic state. So it's interesting that, yeah, just like Sean was saying there, that people were talking about intersectionality before they used that word, and that was certainly the case in the history of activism in South Africa, where in the 80s, that schism between basically poor blacks who historically didn't embrace the concept of gay or homosexual the way that they are doing now. There were ways of being in the community that didn't label people that way, and maybe they could even be treated in a way that honored their sort of like two-spirited people in North American native cultures. But they did want to start coming out and claim human rights in the 1980s in a kind of more modern way, and often got in conflict with the white activists. And so that was in the 80s, and one of the big national organization in that time split apart over the issue of race, which in the region, but especially in South Africa at that time, the correlation between color as determined by the state and poverty and level of education was vast, and it still is. But so that the word intersectionality hadn't been invented, but people were living it, and so I started to notice that complexity, and that led me to keep up the research. And so I'm still doing it, but I'm trying to teach it. And I guess what I'll do is with this, I don't have to go over intersectionality, but this slide kind of interesting to me, courtesy of Gage. Thanks a lot. There it shows you all the different factors, and so the lived experience is there in the dark section, and all these things are affecting the lived experience. So you change one of those, say class, and everything else can remain the same, but the lived experience will be vastly different. And these things change over time. Obviously, to be and place, to be white in South Africa today is going to be very different than if you're white in Nigeria for various historical reasons. And yeah, it does change over time. So that's something we need to keep in mind. One interesting thing about this slide I find is that race has disappeared, and I'm not quite sure why that is, but I'm assuming it's subsumed within ethnicity, which is a little bit ironic because, of course, the concept of intersectionality comes out of struggles against racism in the first instance. So let me get on to the courses I teach here, where I'm pushing the students to think about this in a big way. So the first one is, it's a 300 level course, AIDS, Power, and Poverty. I've got about 100 students there. It's in development studies, by the way, which is an interdisciplinary program. I'm a historian, but my fellow faculty come from everywhere. We have an anthropologist, we have a geographer, political studies, sociologist, and lots of kind of cross-appointed people from outside, even the social sciences and humanities, so in rehabilitation studies, for example. We're trying to get people to think outside the conventional academic boxes. That's kind of one reason we exist as a department. And so in the course, that AIDS, Power, and Poverty, I try and bring all those different ways of thinking about disease, in this case HIV and AIDS, and factor in the cultural, the social, the economic, political factors that make HIV and AIDS manifest itself differently, wildly differently, depending where you are in the world, including in this country, which by coincidence yesterday I was talking about. So Canada is one of the lowest rates of HIV in the world. But when you break it down, you can find places in Canada which have higher prevalence than, say, Nigeria. As a percent of the population living with HIV, it's higher than many African countries, in fact. So those happen to be, First Nations, and Saskatchewan is the worst affected. And so you have these little pockets around the country of unbelievably concentrated, illness. And how can we understand it when we're such a rich country and everyone is so well educated, relatively speaking, and yet they're doing better in Senegal? And that's, by the way, the photo there on the right is my other course. It's a senior seminar, which I call the African Renaissance in comparative perspective. Again, we're looking at all the different factors that shape the experience for people living in Africa today. And the statue there is from Senegal, which was built at great expense. And one of the few things that North Korea exports these days is monumental statues. So you find this one was built by North Korea, and it's really gigantic. And it's celebrating the idea African Renaissance. Africa is being reborn after a period of, great political turmoil. And anyways, that's the hope. And so we're trying to figure out, what's real and what's wishful thinking. So those are the two courses, and I'll just say a couple of things. In both cases, the students here are great, but honestly, they don't know much about either of these topics. Canadian students, I don't know what it's like in New York, but here the vast majority don't get very much exposure to African topics at all. And likewise with AIDS, it did, back in the 80s and 90s, it was all over the place, but it's kind of disappeared from public discourse almost entirely. And I asked my students, what have you learned about AIDS, just when we're getting to know each other? And someone will say, well, we studied it for like a day in high school, like grade 11. And they do get, in both these topics, they get kind of stereotyped answers to really, really complex questions. And we know that there's a long history of that with AIDS, gay-related immunodeficiency. In the early days, people wanted to say this is associated with an immoral lifestyle, right? So they had an easy answer, and then they start to realize, oh, there's other people who are getting it too, and so it gets more and more complicated. But over time, the narrative has emerged that it really is an Africa thing, right? Although that's patently not true, but it's a common belief. And with Africa, people don't know really a lot. They'll have kind of pat answers of why it's generally so underdeveloped relative to other parts of the world. And so I'm pushing them to challenge that and complicate what they know. So I'll just start out with the AIDS course, and I like to use maps because they it's more than 1,000 words that are you can get from there. And so the first map, I don't know if people recognize that, is Ukraine, right? And so one of the things people have in their mind with AIDS, anyways, that's here in Canada. It's an Africa thing, and that's associated in people's minds. Oh, it's probably black thing, right? And so I flipped that map up on there on the left. That's Ukraine. So Ukraine, it's all white folks, right? Pretty well. And that's the highest level of HIV prevalence in Europe, higher than many African countries, including Senegal. And so I get them to look at that map, and the white is the lowest, and the red is the highest, and it's quite, I guess, between white and red, and maybe 6 times the prevalence. So I asked them, how can you explain that? What's the difference between the eastern and the western side of Ukraine? Not that many people know, but we get to the point. But the difference is they speak Russian on that side, and they speak Ukraine on the west side. And then, so how can a virus tell the difference between what language people speak? It doesn't make any sense. It's a virus, for Pete's sake. So we worked through that, and we realized that associated with language comes access to education, jobs, poverty, etc., are differential in those parts of the country. And now add on to the civil war on the eastern side. So all those factors then. So The virus can't tell the difference between what language you speak, but it can tell the difference between other kind of social determinants of health, like poverty, education, etc. So that's evident there. And on the other map there, we're looking at the global view of HIV infection. We're talking 2003, and I know people see that and say, oh my God, that prick's so lazy. He can't even update his maps. Well, that's part of the lesson. Actually, we can put 2018 map on there, and it will hardly have changed in spite of the billions and billions of dollars that have been spent and the education that's out there and all the other breakthroughs. The heaviest infected countries in the world are still in southern and eastern Africa, and in Europe it's Russia and Ukraine, and so it's hardly changed since 2003. The way it's spread around, it's stabilized, but it's definitely it's not going away. So we're looking at that map, and I'm trying to get them to think about what makes it like that. So just look at Africa, and you can see it's not an Africa thing. There's countries in Africa on the north and in the west that have quite low rates. So you can't say it's an Africa thing. So then what is it? Oh, I know the former president of South Africa said, oh, it's a poverty thing. Well, that's kind of rich coming from the president of the wealthiest country in the country. So we can't say, South Africa has got really, really high rates. And yet it's got a great constitution. It's got, well, I won't say it's got a good economy, but compared to Uganda, it's doing pretty well. So you can't say that this one factor and that explains everything. It's really, really all over the place. Yeah, that's there. And so we spend the whole course going through the different factors. Race, class, et cetera. Disability is another one. We talk about, they say, depending how you define it, up to 1 billion people or 15% of the world population has some kind of disability. And so that's a factor that can make people, even who have all the advantages in society, vulnerable to HIV. So moving to the Africa course, we're looking at that and the map there on the left. So that's the HIV prevalence in 2016. And one thing I asked them is, okay, look at that map, and can you tell me the heaviest impacted countries, the dark red, those 3 countries, what is it about those? So we have to research, do they have anything in common? They don't look like they do. Two little islands within South Africa, sort of. Maybe they do, but what's Botswana, the big one? How's that got anything in common? Well, they do a little bit of research, and they find out that culturally, the people actually, the bigger island there, Lesotho, there's more Basotho people who actually live in South Africa than within those borders. So, I mean, it's a cultural continuum from the one side to the other. Botswana is almost, the Setswana language is almost the same as Botswana, culturally very close. So what's going on? Why is it so different, just that little border? What's going on? So they do the research. They find out that those 3 heavily infected countries, they shared a particular type of colonial rule that ended 50 plus years ago. But that phenomenon, that one factor, has really had a long-term legacy that has exposed the people to HIV disproportionately. And my last map, there's the prevalence of HIV in men who have sex with men. And to me, that's an even more interesting map because there's just no pattern whatsoever as far as I can see. There's very heavily affected countries. So if you look at the top there, far west, Mauritania. So if you look on the left map, Mauritania's got one of the lowest overall rates of HIV and likewise Senegal in the general population, and yet in the MSM population, it's one of the highest. So how can you explain that? What's going on that makes what makes that happen? And the long and short of it is that because the kind of the state and religious homophobia and cultural homophobia is so strong that there's no way for people to come out and live a life as gay men. There's just no way. So but they're there, and they have their wives to cover their real erotic lives. So that's a recipe for disaster, so to speak. So yeah, we go through all these things. It's really fun, and I'm going to end up with those picks there because we're talking about using electronic sources. So the 3 books on the right are mine, which come from the research. I thought I started out with a small article in mind. I'm going to get this out and challenge what the president of Zimbabwe was saying, and it's going to be a little scholarly piece in some obscure journal, and it just kept going. Once I started picking at the strings of, how is it people can say things, for example, like, homosexuality is un-African. We're talking a continent of 1 billion people, and you're trying to tell me that it didn't exist before some Europeans came and introduced it? That just doesn't make sense, right? So, and yet people believe that very strongly. Even in the book on the top, right there, that came at a point when I was at a conference focused on HIV and gender, and there was a very prominent African scholar, a medical anthropologist, and he gave a great talk about how gender doesn't just mean women. We need to talk about men too, and masculinity. And I went up to him after. I said, "That's fantastic. I'm so glad you're talking about that," because at that time there was a tendency to use the word gender as if it's totally coterminous with the women, and so this was a great thing. And then I just said to him, "Well, do you know that some African men have sex with African men, and shouldn't you talk about that too?" And he was really uncomfortable with that, but he said, "Sure, yeah." And I gave him some articles and stuff that he could consider for his next speech. Then he publishes a book in which basically there's a chapter denouncing the very idea. Anyone who could even raise that idea that African men have sex with African men or boys was probably racist. And I thought, that is incredible. This guy's a scientist, and he can't even wake up and smell the coffee. So the other book, Heterosexual Africa, is just going through systematically, how did that idea get entrenched in common sense, and not just common sense among the masses of the people, but even in the ranks of top scientists. And it's a really complex story, and you have to go over all these factors that are there. And so that's my stuff. But we come back to, on the left there, this fantastic project, if you ask me, this global encyclopedia. I think it's fantastic for several reasons. It's not only gigantic, it's like 1 million pages or something, and hundreds of essays, over 400, I believe. What I love about it the most is Africa, which I was the original editor, is equally represented to every other region of the world, which never happens. In so-called global queer theory, Africa will be there as a little footnote or something interesting. Some anthropologist wrote 50 years ago. They'll have some little discussion, and that's it. But like I mentioned, there's 1 billion people there, and extremely various ways of living. Some countries in Africa are considered to be upper middle income, if you believe the World Bank. But within those relatively well-off countries, there's vast disparities of wealth, culture, language. Even you say, okay, there's patriarchy there, but you need to pull that apart too. There's societies that are matrilineal, there's societies that are patrilineal, and all those things. So you pull those things apart, and you find that Africa is really a rich source of information if you're researching these things. So you can go there, and it's going to make you think about some of the big generalizations that are coming out of the Western experience about what it means to be LGBT. And so I can give them assignments, like, for example, if I'm going back to the encyclopedia there are, now, there's at least 6, I think there's 7 big entries on HIV, one for each of the regions, and there's another one specifically on the way HIV is represented in Egyptian film. And those are just the articles with the title HIV in it, but there's others that talk about activism. So I could just say, there's 6 or 7 HIV articles. Asia, Africa, North America, etc. So read them all and compare them and make a list. What do the authors of the Africa section say are the most important factors to explain the impact of HIV, the way it spread, and compare that to what the author of the Latin America entry comes up with, or Asia, and you'll see that they'll rank things differently, and that makes for a really great debate. And you can do the same thing, like talking about the lived experience of LGBT people around Africa and how various that is, and people are at different stages of activism and consciousness, and how do you understand that? Well, I can give them an assignment. Go there, look at these. There's about 5 or 6 different chapters on, or I should say entries on different religions in Africa. So Ethiopian Orthodox, Catholicism, Pentecostal, Anglican, etc., and traditional religions. And you look at each one of those and the way they understand and respond, and so it's just a natural way to compare and see how scholars have considered the many different factors, which, like I said, change over time, to explain people's lived experiences. So I'll end on that point, and we have time for questions, I think. Hello, Mark?
Yes, this is Mark.
Oh, yeah.
I would encourage folks to, if you have questions for either of our speakers today, to drop them into the Q&A module. And I believe, Julie, you're going to be moderating that section, correct?
While we wait for Julie, I see a question that I can answer, or I actually can
answer. Please go ahead.
But it says, it's from Sarah Witt, and it says, thank you, you're welcome. Is Gail receptive to making it possible to search the exact full text? I would say, not that I'm speaking for Gail about that possibility, but we actually can search the exact full text. All of the scans were OCR scans, and so similar to if I can just, I don't know if this is going to be hard on people's eyes to go back to my slides. Yeah, that might be too much. Oh, close your eyes. Oh, it wasn't that far. In this slide, we see the green Asian lesbians. That wasn't my highlight. That was the Gail's resource highlight. So you are actually searching the full text when you do a search within these databases. I hope that answers the question.
Great, yeah. And let me see here. Did you, Mark, have anything to say on that?
To tell you the truth, I was trying to figure out what screen we were on, and now I think I've seen the questions. I'm in the chat room, and is that where I should be?
You can be looking at either here. I can just put the questions to you, unless Julie, you would.
Q&A.
Yeah, they're in the Q&A. Unless you, Julie, would prefer to do that.
Oh, I see now. Sarah Witt is pointing out that it doesn't say LGBT in the article, and so the question that you're asking is, I think, the larger question that I was posing, and it really is not focused on the Gale database, but it's all databases and all of the way in which we create metadata for archival material. It's more of a theoretical question. There really is no way to, when we create the metadata for these materials, or when we consider the provenance for how they were donated and text within them, we are still applying today's language. So in 20 years, we may use a different term, but everything that was cataloged today will have specific language. So that's really something just for us to mull over or to keep in mind as we're searching primary sources, to use the language of the time as well as language for today, being aware of how these materials are cataloged and how the metadata is created. So if we're using terms like third world women, we have to know what third world women meant in 1980, even though we don't use that terminology now. Like right now, we're likely using people of color or something of that sort, which may not make sense in 20 years. And so if we just are aware of the shifts in language and when we're cataloging, that will aid in how we're searching moving forward. So I hope that clarifies.
Great. Yeah, I think that's very helpful. We've got a question here from Stephen who says, thanks for the presentations, and would like to share it with a committee on campus. But the question really is, will this info be available to participants in the future? And I would just say that, yes, we did record the session today, and we are recording it. You should be able to find that on our website, choice360.org. We'll also make sure that everyone who signed up gets a link to a YouTube recording. So there should be multiple means of finding it. And I would encourage folks, if you do have other questions, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A module. We have a few minutes here before our time is up today. Give you just a moment to do that.
And Sarah, I agree. Uh-oh, cost. Mark, do you have the answer to that? There's a question from David. What is the cost of the encyclopedia? Are you referring to the ebook encyclopedia that Mark was referencing? Oh, it's being answered. I don't have the answer to that question.
I mean, I can't say exactly. It seems to me I got a notice not too long ago. It was in the $700 or $800 range, which is probably not too bad for 1 million words or whatever. And it's both paper and version.
Great. We've also got a question here, a couple of questions that just came in. One from Cynthia, I believe. And I would put it to both of our speakers today. What challenges have you found in researching LGBTQ primary literature? Sort of a broad question, but I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Sean, can I go?
Sure.
Yeah. So that's a great question, and it's a big issue I want the students to think about, because if we're talking in Africa, a lot of the primary literature, it was written by the colonialists, right? The majority population wasn't literate. They told their stories, orally, and so you have this incredible distorting effect of people who don't speak the local language, who are in a position of power over this majority population, and they're the ones recording everything. So and then you add into the fact that LGBT folks were basically seriously in the closet until quite recently, for the most part. So the invisibility, and where people are visible in the documents, they are misrepresented significantly. So it's a big, big challenge. And anyone who's doing this research has to be acutely aware of that.
I was going to say the exact same thing, referencing the lack of information, but also acknowledging that there have been efforts for people to self-document and to just know the disparity as it exists. So within the Gill resource, always noting where the sources are coming from. When you open any database, looking to which repository it's pulling and knowing how that repository may be skewed in one direction or the other. part of the work that I do is getting Black lesbians who are in their 70s and 80s to submit their material to the archives so that we can use their material for future research. So it's about closing the gaps and being actively aware that there are gaps, but also most people who come to LHA, they'll say something like, you probably don't have anything, or I know that there's nothing out there, because there's in some ways an invisibility myth that exists for LGBT history. And I think as a response to that, there's been a resurgence of archiving that has happened in the past 10, 15 years. So responding to that and knowing how the shifts are affecting research moving forward. So just being aware of the conversation, knowing that these repositories are being there's a new commitment to them, or as Stonewall 50 is approaching, an ALMS conference is going to be in Berlin this year, so there's going to be a lot of new possibilities for how we are researching the LGBTQ past.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, good. I've been trying. I see somebody has a question about the databases. Karen has a question about the databases, if there's overlap between, I believe, Archives of Sexuality and Gender and Contemporary Women's Issues, and there is not. So I wanted to put that out there, answer that question.
Thank you. That's excellent. And we have another question, I think, here from Karen, perhaps as well. Does the Lesbian Her Story archive contain a lot of oral histories, recordings of interviews, other stories of that sort, or of other sorts?
And I just said yes.
Oh, you did.
There are thousands of oral histories. They're not all digitized, though, so you have to come in. We do have full runs of, say, NPR recordings. We have love letters sent between lovers on tape. We do have, there is a site that Pratt University library students created, Pratt Stills. I can put the site URL in the bar, but ultimately it holds a lot of our oral history collections, including Audre Lorde's collection, the Boots of Leather, Slippers of Gold. So there's a few online oral history projects other than those that are on site.
Excellent, excellent. All right, well, we are coming, I think, to the end of our time today. So I would just say to you, Sean, thank you, and to you, Mark, thank you for your presentations today. I would remind the folks out in the audience out there that you should be able to see in your chat box a link to our survey, to the post-webinar survey. If you could take just a few minutes, it's only 5 questions, to let us know how we did today, we would really appreciate it. So please take a second to do that. And I would also mention that, as I've said a few times, we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email with a link to the recording. And thanks again to everyone out there for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed the session, and I hope the rest of your day is great.
Thanks
you. Very
Bye.
much.
Thanks. Bye. Nice meeting you all.
Nice meeting you too. Bye.
Yeah. Cheers.
Bye-bye.